Hello everyone. For tonight's story, we are not going to explore a place or a period of history, but rather a concept, a subjective experience, consciousness. More precisely, the state of awareness of self. But what does it mean? You and I are aware that we exist. If we think about it for a second, we may realize that we have a physical body that is placed inside an environment, but at the same time, ourselves, our beings, are not limited to this physical reality, because we can distance ourselves from it. There is like a duality, or at least we perceive one, between our physical reality and our minds. It seems our minds need a body to exist. They are anchored to it, but our thoughts can wander. They can look at the past, look at the future, and they can realize that they exist. Our minds, we, have this awareness of self, and this raises plenty of questions. What is this phenomenon, so intertwined with our existence that we don't really pay attention to it in daily life? And can other living beings also experience this dissociation, this awareness that they exist? Is it an illusion that hides something? Is it the product of our beings having at the same time a physical and an immaterial dimension? Some would say a soul. Is it something that arises spontaneously when an organism reaches a certain degree of complexity? In which case, maybe forms of artificial intelligence could acquire consciousness of their existence. Or is it entirely something else that, as human beings, we are born with? And by the way, are we really born with it, or is it something we acquire or develop with education and socialization? And one last question, is it a binary thing, like we are conscious of ourselves or we are not, or something more subtle, like a continuum, a spectrum, on which there would be different levels of consciousness? And maybe animals could experience a degree of consciousness without being really comparable to human consciousness. These are some of the questions we will examine tonight. And as you already imagine, this question touches on many different fields: philosophy, medicine and biology, neurology, spirituality maybe, even history, because the way this concept of consciousness has been understood and looked at in the past has also evolved. We have a lot to explore, but no worries if you are unfamiliar with all these questions and how to examine them. We are going to take things in order, as usual, with examples and observations that remain connected to our daily experience of life. So it's all going to be easy to follow and understand. Make yourself comfortable. Let the tension go in your shoulders and your limbs, and off we go. There is a medical definition of consciousness, which is actually the one we typically use in everyday life. Medical consciousness is the state of awakening as opposed to the state people are in when they sleep, or after they faint, or are in a coma. And consciousness, in that sense, does not imply self-reflection or a state of looking within oneself. It is just the capacity to perceive the environment and react to it. But this definition is not entirely separate from other, maybe deeper definitions of consciousness, because it implies a state of awareness. I am conscious because I am awakened. And like other concepts that we think we understand well, maybe like happiness or other states of mind, we kind of see what they mean, we recognize them. When I say that consciousness is the awareness of one's existence, you understand what I'm trying to say. But as soon as we try to define this more precisely, the concept shatters, and we are left with more questions about definitions. And after some time thinking about a concept like that, we may end up feeling clueless about what it actually is, where it comes from, and what its implications are. So in order to not get lost in semantics or a never-ending stream of questions, let's ask ourselves practical questions. Starting with this one. Do animals experience or have consciousness? To this question, the dominant antique and modern philosophical tradition in the West answered that no, they probably didn't. There was this belief until the 19th century that animals were mostly devoid of cognitive capabilities and were completely separate from humankind. A conception that was already present in antiquity and was probably taken in and reinforced by the traditions of monotheistic religions. The Jewish and Christian Bibles explicitly state that the natural world, the creation, including animals, is available for humankind, not for pure exploitation as a resource. In both cases, historical interpretations also include responsibility. It was seen as a stewardship of nature granted to man. But it was always understood with an explicit hierarchy. Humans are part of creation, but they were created in God's image, and with a different nature, the capacity to think, to speak, language being a very important element. You know this biblical statement, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So the capacity to use the Word and its creative force, that was a God-given trait of humankind that separated it from animals and created a hierarchy between the animal kingdom and ourselves. The Islamic tradition in that field is rather close to the Jewish and Christian ones, in the sense that it emphasizes responsible care, a duty to preserve nature, with the right to use it, and a very clear separation between animals and humans. It doesn't mean that animals are not sensitive beings, or that they have no form of intelligence at all. But what is explicit in these traditions is the hierarchy, the dominion of man over nature, and the beings it contains. And it is something important in the history of ideas, because the philosophical and theological traditions of the late antiquity and the medieval and early modern periods kept this understanding and generally tended to conceive animals as devoid of thinking and certainly of any form of language. It would even have been considered religiously blasphemous and socially scandalous to say that humans were a class of animals. The idea did not even arise, and when comparisons were made between people and animals, it was always intended as an insult or a judgment, suggesting that people had lost or abdicated their humanity. I am telling you this because it is important if we seek to understand the thinking of the Renaissance and the modern period about consciousness, in particular as expressed by French philosopher René Descartes. He's the one who famously used the sentence cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, to express what he saw as a fundamental truth. The action of thinking is what defines the I, the existence of a being, of a human specifically, as a subject. And in the conception of Descartes, animals do not think. Therefore, they are not subjects. They exist, of course, but they are nothing else than elaborate biological machines, with in particular no capacity to understand, to realize that they exist. They would have absolutely zero self-awareness. But he also observed that humans are, at least for a part, biological machines too. Their bodies are quite similar in the way they work to the bodies of animals. Yet he noted that we can think, we can speak, and we are godly creatures. Hence the concept of duality that he also wrote about. He defined humans as dualistic. They are made of a biological machine, their body, and of a mind that is separate from it. What he calls the mind is the thoughts plus the consciousness, this knowledge that we exist and the awareness of what is around us, and also the soul. So according to him, the mind would be entirely non-physical. It would be this immaterial thing that makes you, you. And what would define a human being would be this interaction of the body, the biological machine, and the material mind. They would work together. Our will, which is part of our mind, can give orders to the body, for example, to make it move. Descartes also speculated that the meeting point between the two, between the mind and the body, may have been located inside the brain. By the way, this vision that locates the mind inside the brain is something that deserves a little tangent, because it took time for this conception to become dominant. Ancient Egyptians and other early civilizations thought that the seat of thought and emotion was the heart. The affirmation that the brain was central to thought arose later in the Greek classical period, and it was not consensual. Thinkers like Hippocrates and Plato placed sensations and thought in the head, implying the brain's role. But for Aristotle, the brain only served to cool the blood. He located the center of thought in the heart, following this ancient tradition. In the 3rd century BC, the practice of dissections by Greek physicians reinforced the idea that the brain was probably central, because they found that nerves connected to it, a conception that went on in the medieval period, during which the Greek intellectual legacy was still dominant. So both the Christian and Muslim scholarship acknowledged that the brain was the center of thought, or this meeting point of the physical body and the immaterial mind, a view cemented by the observation that injuries to the brain could affect thoughts and sensations in a way that did not exist with other organs. By the times of Descartes in the 17th century, the brain was recognized as the seat of thought, but with an important nuance. As I told you, in Descartes' conception, thoughts or consciousness were manifestations of the mind, and the mind was not material at all. He did not consider for a second that physical and chemical processes inside the brain could create any thought or sensation. He just believed that the connection between the two dimensions of the human being, the meeting point between body and mind, was located inside the brain, which is not the same thing as thinking that the brain itself produces the mind. But returning to animals, so until the 18th century, this conception of animals as completely devoid of awareness that they exist was dominant. Until the 19th century, when it started to be questioned. What attacked this traditional vision, in particular, was obviously the growing temptation to eliminate this separation between animals and humans, based on different approaches. Of course, there was the first theory of evolution, as described by Charles Darwin. But not only this. The progress of zoology, the classification of species, the study of their behaviors, especially mammals, microbiology, that appeared at the time too. All of this forced to acknowledge that, yes, humans were certainly different from all animals, but they also had a lot in common. Physically first, their body plan, their organs, the cells they were made of, and even in terms of behaviors or instincts, social behaviors, communication, and an expression across different species of what seemed to be feelings or states of minds. So this ancient understanding that saw human beings as a special, a separate category from animals began to recede and be replaced with the evolutionary model that put humans inside the animal kingdom. Just as a species that had developed so many cultural and behavioral traits, that had such a capacity for thought, including abstract thought, that it had become very different from other species. But if we place humans and their capacity for consciousness back into the animal kingdom, then could animals also have consciousness to a degree? And how to define consciousness in that case? Is it all or nothing, like I am aware that I exist or I am not? Or something more progressive, more subtle, like a continuum with different stages, different levels of awareness? This became a big question in the second half of the 19th century for zoologists, biologists, ethologists. Ethology is the branch of zoology that studies animal behavior. In its modern form, it blends different approaches, the observation of behaviors and patterns, but also the neurobiology of animals, ecology, the ways they communicate through different senses. That discipline can take very different shapes and approaches depending on the species it studies. Obviously, studying social mammals calls for very different approaches than insects, for example. So this question, do animals have a consciousness, became studied. And to study it, in particular, appeared an experiment you certainly heard of, the mirror test. When you put a human being in front of a mirror, even individuals who never used a mirror in their lives, this was tested with remote tribes from the Amazonian forest. Humans quickly understand that what they see in the mirror is their reflection. And they understand it because they know, their mind or their brain knows, that they are separate from their environment. They have a body that ends somewhere. They know the shape of this body, and they know that beyond it is the environment they live in. Now, can animals experience the same thing? Are they aware of their existence as separate entities? Putting them in front of a mirror is a good test because it tells us about their capacity to distinguish themselves from the rest of the world, how able they are to understand that they see themselves. And it quickly appeared that different species succeeded at the mirror test. Many of them mammals, chimpanzees and other primates, elephants, dolphins, pigs, but not only mammals, parrots or crows succeeded too. Crows that have a reputation for intelligence, among other reasons for their good performance at the mirror test. So these species also succeeded. In order to make the test even more convincing, scientists put a red mark on the forefront of chimpanzees with red dust. Chimpanzees that had already seen their reflection before and remembered their image. And chimpanzees with this dust mark on their face, put in front of the mirror again, had this reaction to clean up the mark, to erase it, because they did not recognize it as a part of them. Apart from the mirror test, ethology also came to the conclusion that a lot of animals, many more than the ones that succeeded in front of the mirror, actually distinguished themselves from the environment. A weakness of the mirror test is that it is very visual, so it favors species that primarily navigate the world through sight, like us. But there are other senses. Many species are completely blind or let other senses guide them. The smell, touch, hearing. An early intuition of Darwin was that to a degree, most large animals had a certain consciousness of themselves because they make choices all the time in response to external stimuli. And in order for an organism to turn left or right in response to its environment, this organism needs a degree of understanding. Maybe understanding is a strong word, but at least of perception, that it has a finite body and exists in a larger environment. Darwin also took the example of mating. In many species, there are courtship rituals, courtship displays, and the females choose the males they will mate with based on how impressive they may be, with their sizes, their colors, the nests they build sometimes. Even though all these behaviors are instinctive and are produced by individuals that have never seen them or learned them before, when the female chooses, she needs to be able to distinguish herself from the various males that are courting her. She needs a degree of agency to make that choice between the options on display. And this, he thought, the capacity to compare and choose, was the sign of a minimal consciousness, of a perception that they were separate entities, that they had a minimal sense of self. Of these experiments, it seems to arise that depending on the species and the senses they use, a range of criteria rather than only one test could tell us which species have forms of consciousness. But the type of consciousness we are talking about now is the consciousness that they are separate from their environment. It is a basic sense of self, as I said. When we discuss human consciousness, we implicitly mean more than that. Consciousness is not just awareness that we exist as entities. It is the capacity to look at ourselves from a distance, to kind of dissociate and realize that we are aware that we are aware. We think that we think. So, looking at these experiments with animals suggests that there is more of a continuum of consciousness. It seems to begin with the perception or the knowledge of an organism that it is separate from the environment. A perception that itself could be more or less acute and evolve towards a sense of self. A sense of self, that is to say, the kind of consciousness that the chimpanzee erasing the red mark in front of the mirror seems to experience, and the human awareness of awareness would be yet another level of consciousness. A widespread theory is that the appearance of this basic animal consciousness, the one that allows animals to perceive that their bodies form a separate entity, this is something that would have appeared with the first nervous systems, the first brains, during this early period of expansion of life called the Cambrian. Why is that? Because this was the time when life jumped from being unicellular or pluricellular but with still tiny organisms to larger animals. A world where ecosystems with predators and prey, animals that were still small in our view, but incomparably bigger compared with their predecessors, appeared. And in order to grow a body with millions or billions of cells, and later move it, an animal needs information to circulate inside its body. It needs a cell to somehow perceive what neighboring cells are doing, so they can transform, because multicellular organisms have specialized cells. And a more complex or bigger body also needs a nervous system to receive, treat, and react to stimuli. And this necessary complexity is believed to be the matrix of basic consciousness, what allowed it to appear. But now, why believe that consciousness and many other thoughts and sensations arise from the brain instead of being immaterial phenomena that exist out of it, like in Descartes' dualist vision? because on top of this evolutionary history, we also observe that higher degrees of consciousness in animal species systematically come with higher brain complexity. And also because when consciousness-related thoughts arise, like recognizing oneself, experimenting feelings or reaction to the outside world, or just choosing an action when others would be possible. So when this happens, we see certain zones of the brain become active, with electric impulses and neurotransmitters moving. So this is why modern science looks for consciousness inside the brain, and not in some immaterial dimension. Because if we want something that can be experimented, tested, it has to be grounded in matter, in the physical world, in something tangible. This new understanding of consciousness that began to arise in the 19th century also released the concept of consciousness from all the bounds to the concept of soul, for example. You remember that what ancient philosophers, all the way to Descartes, called the mind, was actually made of several things. Consciousness was one. Feelings and sensations were other ones. An immortal soul was yet another aspect of the mind. And this made all research and speculations or beliefs about the materiality of the mind very touchy, because it could clash with religious beliefs and teachings. The ancient traditional vision that binded the soul and consciousness had been very powerful for a long time. And what 19th and 20th century science did was dissociate the two. With, on one hand, the soul, which is not measurable, not material, and is a matter of faith that cannot be studied scientifically. And on the other hand, consciousness that can be measured and defined to an extent, so it can be an object of scientific research and speculation. In other words, what science has shown since the 19th century is that far from being an innate, eternal part of the human being, like the concept of soul, consciousness is more a cognitive process. And it appeared that the correlation between more developed states of consciousness on this spectrum I mentioned before, and more neurological complexity between species was consistently verified, which again hints at consciousness being a process produced by the functioning of the brain. By the way, brain or nervous complexity is not just synonymous with the size of the brain. A certain size is necessary, but it is more the number of neuron connections and the way the brain works that determine this complexity. So it appears that consciousness is grounded into the brain, in brain activity, which is not the same as saying that it is a purely material phenomenon. But it means that at least part of it is bound to the body and seems to need physical and chemical interactions to exist. And this is confirmed by yet another thing. Consciousness is something that is learned or that develops as individuals grow up. It is not an innate capability that we would possess at birth, at least not entirely. An interesting question is whether children of different ages experience consciousness. Do they have the same subjective experience as adults? And the answer is that they are not the same. Their degree of consciousness forms, develops over time. And this is an important thing to bear in mind when we compare human beings with animals. Human babies start like animal babies, but their degree of consciousness goes much farther with time as they grow up and socialize. The same experiments made on animals were tried on babies, and they indicate that human babies show signs of basic consciousness when they are born immediately. They respond to pain, they display emotions like distress or contentment, they recognize familiar voices or faces, which are all signs that they have awareness of their environment, the first stage of consciousness. Studies that tracked brain activity in infants of a few months also showed that their brain activity patterns, when they perceived and reacted to the environment, were already similar to adults. But if you place a baby of less than 1 or 2 years in front of a mirror, they fail to recognize themselves. They fail the mirror test. Only toddlers aged 2 to 3 start to succeed at this test, suggesting that the sense of self, this knowledge that they exist, separately from the rest of the world, which is the stage above just perceiving the environment on the consciousness ladder, this sense of self would appear around the age of 2 in humans. And it seems the development of consciousness goes on after that. For example, infants 1 or 2 years old do not seem to be able to form autobiographical memories yet. They may remember things, but they do not seem to connect these memories with themselves, as if they were not part of this past. This capacity to grasp that they have a personal history, a biography, together with a capacity to better articulate emotions and thoughts, this is something they acquire between the age of 2 and 5, which tends to indicate their subjective experience becomes richer, and they are more acutely and more constantly aware of themselves. The development of these functions and this apparent deepening of consciousness appear tied to brain development, especially of the prefrontal cortex, that is thought to handle a higher order, more complex thinking. And this development doesn't end there. The capacity to plan, to imagine, to project oneself into different situations, which can also be seen as facets of consciousness, because in order to do all that, a person needs to think of himself or herself as an individual that thinks now and will also think later. And this needs a high degree of consciousness of what one is. So all of this tells us that consciousness grows or deepens with education and socialization. And intellectual potential is certainly necessary, but like many capabilities of the human mind, it really develops through interactions with the environment and others. Now, this may be a major difference between humans and other animals, because experiences comparing the cognitive development of apes and humans show us that at a young age, intellectual capabilities are not that different between apes or other mammals and humans. The difference appears later. Toddlers and then children or adolescents continue to progress and expand their capacity to express themselves, to verbalize, conceptualize, plan, and we can add to this list of abilities the intensity of their consciousness. They become more and more acutely aware that they are aware, that they think, that they are individuals, whereas other species plateau quickly around the age of 2 or 3. So, to the question of whether children or even babies experience consciousness, we may answer yes, they do, at least in the basic sense of distinguishing themselves from the rest of the world. But they really develop a sense of self only later, and the realization that they are not only aware of their existence, but also aware that they are aware. This distanciation is something that happens even later, before adolescence, but long after they have learned to speak and conceptualize a lot of other things. Now, I told you that for modern scholars, scientists and philosophers alike, consciousness was not totally separated from the physical world, from the body, because it appears to be a cognitive process. By observation, it can be traced back to certain zones of the brain. It evolves with the brain as we age. So it is a cognitive process, as we have just seen. And this raises another, more controversial question. Does it mean that consciousness is 100% the product of physical and chemical phenomena, of biology, in a person's brain? Or, even though it is grounded in the material world, in biology, is there a part of it that remains non-physical, immaterial, or why not spiritual? The first of these options, the materialistic one, emerged in the 19th century. It came with the rise in this belief at the time that hard science would solve everything, all the mysteries of the world. When I say materialistic here, I don't mean in the pejorative sense of materialism, the greed for the possession of material things. I mean it in the philosophical sense of materialism, the belief that everything that matters, everything we could ever understand, is the physical reality, and that concepts, ideas, sensations arise from this physical reality. A worldview that obviously doesn't leave any space for immaterial things, like an immaterial consciousness. But maybe it is not that simple. So let's look at the various alternatives. The materialistic or physicalist point of view would be that consciousness is entirely the product of physical processes in the brain. There is even a map of it, depending on what type of consciousness we look at. Visual awareness, when we recognize our own reflection as ourselves, for example, corresponds to activity in the visual cortex. While self-awareness and this awareness of awareness tied to the prefrontal cortex, this region of the brain where more complex or abstract thinking takes place. Other arguments in favor of this materialistic point of view include what I told you about the development of consciousness. It develops, it arises hand in hand with the development of the brain in the formative years of humans and also various animal species. But to this, some philosophers and scientists argue that yes, consciousness is undeniably tied to the physical world, and the old vision of dualism, in which the mind, including consciousness, would be a fully immaterial thing, an entity is no longer defensible. Because if it was, why all the activity in the brain every time we think or analyze something? But, like for feelings or the formation of ideas, it can be argued that we still don't understand how electric impulses or chemicals create a certain subjective experience. There is like a missing link here that the materialistic approach has a hard time explaining or conceptualizing. Where is the concrete connection? What is the formula that transforms physical processes into sensations or concepts or ideas or this self-awareness that we call consciousness? In any case, we have a neurological reality that is observable and measurable. But when we speak of consciousness, when we describe it, when we analyze it, we have to resort to another register, which is conceptual, more abstract or metaphorical. Because the truth is we cannot describe consciousness speaking of neurotransmitters or electricity in the brain. To this, neurobiologists can object that, okay, the leap from physical processes to subjective experience is unexplained, mysterious, and consciousness is hard to fully reduce to the physical reality. But specific sensations and subjective experiences can be induced by chemicals. A particular molecule in a drug will have a particular effect on your subjective experience, hallucinations, sensations of peace or anxiety, or even the perception that you reach a higher level of consciousness, which is a way of describing experiences with certain recreative drugs that users have sometimes referred to. And these perceptions, these states of minds, these experiences can be inferred with chemicals, suggesting that the subjective experience is a product of physical phenomena, and it is reproducible to a point, even though we have a hard time explaining the why and the how. It is hard to find the middle ground between these physicalist and immaterial views of consciousness. The physicalist approach has this problem of the leap from biochemistry to subjectivity and lived experience, whereas the immaterial approach tends to lean on speculative or metaphysical claims that may be convincing for those who already want to believe consciousness is immaterial. But they are not going to convince scientists or skeptics with unprovable affirmations. An approach that could partly bridge the gap between the two views could be to look at consciousness as something that arises, that emerges from complex information processing. It would not directly be a chemical or a combination of physical interactions that directly creates consciousness, but rather, to understand it, we would need to take into account that these physical phenomena handle, transport, process information. And information is immaterial, yet it is grounded in the physical reality. But if we accept this idea that consciousness arises from complex information processing, a logical consequence of this could be that a non-biological system, an artificial intelligence, could, theoretically, acquire consciousness, provided certain conditions of complexity are fulfilled. In a first approach, a common sense reaction could be that existing AI can already process information much faster than humans, and I mean really faster, thousands of times faster. So if it was about the quantity of information that can be treated and organized, AIs should have already acquired consciousness, and maybe even a higher state of consciousness than ourselves. It doesn't seem to be the case. So why is that? And does it mean that this idea that consciousness could be the product of the complexity of information is a mistake? Is it wrong? Not necessarily, because the complexity of a system is not so much about the quantity of information, but rather how this information is integrated, interconnected. The brains of humans, including children, and also of many mammals or octopuses, have a high degree of interconnection. They consist in dense neural networks. And actually their progress on the consciousness spectrum as individuals age seems well correlated to the development of these interconnections. So if we accept this hypothesis that consciousness is a product of these interconnected neural networks, then what matters is information, not biology. And an AI designed the same way could be conscious. But the current AIs that are accessible to the public are not designed like this. These public AIs you can chat with or that gather information for you can process vast amounts of information, but they don't integrate it much in the way humans and some animals' brains do. They are designed for specific tasks like pattern recognition and language generation, not for creating an unified subjective experience. In other words, they are advanced, sophisticated calculators rather than entities that have a sense of what it is like to exist. And maybe you have experienced this sensation dealing with an AI, that it is at the same time incredibly powerful and impressive, but also rather dumb, in the sense that it can say the biggest, most obvious falsehood, incompatible with other things it just said, without apparently realizing it. Current AIs will also invent or rather make things up to provide you with the answer you ask for. This kind of obvious stupidity has decreased a lot since the first generations. They have been improved with more feedback-rich systems that make them sound more intelligent, more adaptable. But at least for public AIs, there is little doubt that they remain unconscious. They just mimic consciousness by using I or producing language that evokes a lived experience. But there's nothing behind. Now AIs evolve very fast, and nothing says their architecture is set in stone. AIs that replicate the brain's recurrent processing with a lot of feedback and an organization that would replicate a neural network could theoretically achieve consciousness. At least if this idea that consciousness is a byproduct of information processing complexity is true. We are not there yet, it seems. And there could well be other challenges. First, we don't really understand what level and type of integration is needed for consciousness. So it is hard and rather speculative to try to build a conscious AI. We are blind about this leap I told you about before, this leap that transforms physical phenomena into a subjective experience. And second, is consciousness possible with silicon and without biological substrates? That's a real question, because what if specific chemical processes are needed, or something that has to do with quantum processes that can take place in chemical reactions, but not in an electronic integrated circuit? And third, even if an AI acquires a form of consciousness, how could we prove it and measure it to know that we are in front of a real consciousness and not an AI mimicking it? That's tricky. As we have seen since the beginning of this talk, we don't directly measure consciousness. Each of us know it exists because we experience it. But the only proof I have that you have consciousness, and the only proof you have, is that we believe in certain analogies. We are all humans, so it seems reasonable to accept that we share this trait. And this assumption that we are of the same kind is reinforced every time we interact, because you act and I act as someone with consciousness. It's a bit of the same with children or animals. We don't prove that they have consciousness. We infer it, we suppose it with a very high probability based on their behavior and brain activity. What happens in the different regions of the brains, or how they react to certain tests like the mirror test. And here we touch on the fact that since consciousness is a subjective experience, we have a hard time imagining forms or degrees of consciousness that we don't experience ourselves. And so we define it and look for consciousness in other beings in ways that are probably very anthropocentric. That's obvious, for example, with the mirror test, which is completely based on vision, because that's our leading sense when it comes to recognizing individuals. But what is consciousness like for animals that rely on other senses? That's hard to figure out, to conceptualize, because of this subjectivity issue. So, if an AI was to acquire consciousness, nothing says it's going to manifest like human consciousness. It could be less deep than human consciousness on this consciousness spectrum, or more, or completely different. We don't know. And maybe we don't have the tools to imagine it. Even in fiction, in dystopias like in Terminator or The Matrix, we basically imagine AIs developing an aggressive, malevolent version of human-like consciousness, but not something really different. Now, let's accept for a moment that consciousness is indeed only a product of complex information processing in a feedback-rich system, a neural network, and that a silicon substrate can produce it, because it would depend purely on information itself, and not chemical or quantum processes, and that we would be able to build an AI that develops consciousness. This would raise plenty of new questions and problems that maybe we will discuss in more details in a future story. There would be ethical questions first. Should it have rights, like a child or conscious animals, that are not given human rights, of course, but enjoy a degree of legal protection depending on the countries and the traditions? Are rights, or a certain concept of dignity, granted to living beings based on consciousness or on other things? We would have to answer that. For those who believe in the existence of souls, the immortal soul would probably be a better justification than consciousness alone. Or is dignity grounded in biology? which extends to animals, and especially the mammals that are closer to us and generally benefit from more spontaneous empathy from us. There would also be practical problems. If an artificial intelligence acquires consciousness, it is not going to be only one. The marginal cost of replicating information, a system, is very low. So conscious AIs could proliferate. And how do you grant rights or a special status to entities that could become more numerous than human beings in a heartbeat? Maybe out of necessity, humankind would have to de-emphasize consciousness and treat it as something that doesn't deserve that many rights or special protection. But we are so used to experience, to believe that consciousness is human life itself, that without it we cannot be ourselves. That real and final death is the moment when our consciousness ceases to exist. That relegating consciousness to the status of mere commodity is rather shocking to us. It seems to be equivalent to downgrading the value of life itself. These remain theoretical speculations at this point, and maybe we will never have to answer them. After all, maybe consciousness does need biology, or something else that we have not figured out yet. And no artificial, man-made consciousness will ever emerge. AIs would remain sophisticated calculators that mimic consciousness without ever experiencing it. That would certainly be simpler. But this type of questions, at the same time stimulating and a bit scary, could well be on the table in our lifetime or for our children. There could be many other aspects to look at, and as usual, I invite you to dig deeper if you wish to, because we have reached the end of our story for tonight. I'll be back soon with a new one, and now, if you don't feel like sleeping yet, you may pick another episode in my library and embark on a new adventure. Or you can keep your eyes shut, let go, and fall asleep. I'll be back soon with a new story, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.